This is going to be pretty shocking for some of you. There is a dividing line in the book of Romans. This changes our understanding of the golden chain of redemption and who the elect are. Romans is actually a letter of reconciliation between the Jew and the Gentile believers.
And those whom he called, these he also justified. Those whom he justified, these he also glorified.
The Roman church at this time transitioned from predominantly a Jewish church now mainly to a Gentile church after the expulsion of the Jews.
You cannot break this chain as Paul writes it.
Now, the first session was already, by itself, a major discovery, but we're just getting started. If you haven't yet, please share this series with your friends so that they can join in the conversation as well. As a brief reminder, here are the main points in session 1 to keep in mind as we move on in the series. Number 1 is the debate. This study is related to the debate I had with Dr. James White on February 24th of 24, in which I shared the two-part Romans understanding, and it became what we debated over during a portion of our time. Number 2 is the ambiguous antecedent. The first session focused on the ambiguous antecedent in Romans 1:13, and Dr. White in his rebuttal time noted that this was central during my opening remarks. Now, while session 2 will be a great discovery by itself, I highly encourage you to watch session 1 first, as each session will build off each other and provide the proper context of the study. In session 1, I defined an ambiguous antecedent and gave examples while also using Gordon Fee's book to define proper exegesis. I then proceeded to explain and document the following 3 truths that made a huge difference. Number 1 is I documented that when Paul uses the you also in verses 6 through 15, he is saying you in addition to the Gentiles. Paul is clarifying that he is writing separately to the Jewish believers in the first 8 chapters. Secondly, I used definitions provided by Paul in Romans that verified the terms the beloved and the called contextually in verse 7 of chapter 1 are by Paul's definition none other than the Jewish believers. And note that I used an excerpt where John Piper eloquently explained why Paul was not writing to all in Rome in Romans 1:7. And so allow me to quickly point out the fact that Piper does not advocate the two-part Romans understanding. I also gave a direct quote from Johann Bengel's commentary about Paul's use of the word beloved. And also, Johann Bengel did not see Paul writing separately to the Jews in the first 8 chapters. And thirdly, through exegesis, I provided ample evidence that the ambiguous antecedent of 1:13 can be resolved and should be definitely read and understood to be saying the following, quote, to you, the Jewish believers, as well as the rest of the Gentiles, I have yet to evangelize, end quote. These 3 points are so important they are foundational to all other sessions, and of course to the proper exegesis of the book of Romans. We're only going to be expounding on this. This series is based on the book, Two-Part Romans, written by Dr. Brent Lay, published back in 2017. There is a link below where you can pick up a copy of the book on Amazon for less than $10. As Dr. Gordon Fee states, there are 2 primary categories in exegesis: historical context and literary context. Our goal is to discover the original intent of the author. He says the key to good exegesis is the ability to ask the questions of the text in order to get the author's intended meaning. Dr. Fee emphasizes that the first step should be to survey the historical context in general. This, of course, includes questions about the author, its recipients, the circumstances, as well as what historical situation occasioned this writing. And so I encourage you to make notes as we proceed. And if you are taking notes, please write down these three titles. Number 1 is The Great Expulsion. Number 2 is The Great Connection. And number 3, The Great Gap. These three titles will serve as our outline as we proceed. Number 1 is The Great Expulsion. The book of Romans is thought to have been written about 57 AD. To do a Bible study in the book of Romans without studying the historical context of the great expulsion of the Jews from Rome in approximately 49 AD would represent a massive oversight. This would be the same as doing a review concerning the historical context of the United States and leaving out an event like the Civil War or the Great Depression. Many of us have heard or have experienced a church split, and church splits can leave its imprint for years afterward. Some churches do not ever recover. Losing part of your church family can be devastating. A major split has occurred in the church or house churches in Rome within an estimated 5 to 7 years previous to Paul writing Romans. So let's review some historical accounts about the Great Expulsion upon which, if not all, Jewish believers were expelled from the church in Rome in about 49 AD. This is an historical account. Bible Believers Archaeology, Volume 1, Historical Evidence That Proves the Bible by John Argybright. He writes this.
In 49 AD, the Roman Emperor Claudius Caesar expelled all Jews from the city of Rome. This account is recorded by Suetonius, a court official who served under the Emperor Hadrian. He wrote a history entitled The Life of Claudius, in which he stated the following: because the Jewish people were continually causing disorders, the catalyst being Chrestus, he expelled them from Rome. Note, Chrestus may be an alternate spelling for Christus commonly used by Gentiles and may refer to Christ.
Dr. Kenneth Birding, a professor of New Testament at Talbot School of Theology, has written an article entitled Something About the Book of Romans that he says, this will help you really get it.
Kenneth Birding, in his article, Something About the Book of Romans that will help you really get it right. In AD 49, the Roman Emperor Claudius kicked the Jews out of Rome. Jewish Christians, of course, would have been expelled along with the rest of the Jews during the 5 years between Claudius's edict, AD 49, and his death AD 54, when the edict lapsed and Jews started to return. The composition and self-understanding of the house churches in Rome would have shifted considerable. Paul's letter to the Romans would have arrived in Rome somewhere around 57, during the period when Jews were still trickling back into Rome. If you can fix in your mind that the exposure of Jews from Rome had a tremendous impact on the churches in that city, you will understand the message of Romans oh so much better.
John MacArthur sums up the situation very well in his sermon entitled The Gospel in Vanity Fair, and we pick up in his sermon as he reads.
Following Tiberius, Claudius in 49 AD banished all Jews from Rome altogether. Every one of them had to go. Now we know a little about Claudius, and the reason we do is that about 70 years after the edict that was written, about 120 AD, Suetonius wrote about Claudius. Suetonius was a historian, and he got all the information on Claudius, and he wrote about his life. And one of the statements that Suetonius makes in his life of Claudius is this: as the Jews were indulging in constant riots, listen, at the instigation of Chrestus, Claudius banished them from Rome. Now, Claudius unloaded all of the Jews because they were always having riots. And the riots were instigated by a person named Chrestus. Now, you know, you can go back in history till you're blue in the face. You'll never find anybody in that area who fits the bill named Chrestus. But what is very interesting is that the Greek Chrestus is only one letter different than the Greek Christus, which is Christ. It's only the difference between an I and an E. And what it seems to be indicating is this, that what caused Claudius to send all the Jews out was they were rioting over the issue of Christ, which indicates probably some missionaries had come there and had proclaimed Christ again, as always was done in the synagogue, and as always happened with Paul, right? A riot ensued, and the element that had accepted Jesus Christ as Messiah was set against the Jews who were unbelieving, and they threw the city into turmoil, and Claudius got uptight and kicked them all out of town. They were indulging in constant riots at the instigation of Chrestus, and you see, Suetonius thinks that Chrestus is some guy who lived then in Rome. And remember, he was writing 70 years later, so it's easy to see how he could have made that simple error. They were probably rioting over the issue of Christ. And it seems to me that kind of issue would preclude the fact there had to be Christ presented there, so therefore there was the possibility of Aquila and Priscilla being saved already, you see? And so they arrive over there in Corinth to ply their trade, and they're already Christians.
So our first major point of the historical context is a major split in the Church of Rome has occurred prior to Paul's writing of Romans. This is a widely accepted historical fact. For anyone to present a study of Romans and not at least mention or talk about this is hard to imagine. And then this brings us to a very important second point concerning the historical context of Romans, which is the Great Connection.
Now here is Aquila and Priscilla. Now you've heard those names, haven't you? You've studied the Bible. They became two of the most beloved friends of Paul. By the time he wrote the book of Romans, which was later on in another visit to Corinth, the church at Rome had already grown to the place where the faith of those Christians had spread all over the world. And one of the things that may have helped to spread that faith was that all the Christians got booted out of there. All the Jewish Christians. Now the Gentile Christians remained, and the church had remained with the Gentiles who remained, but the Jews who scattered may have been part of the propagation of the church and the character of it that existed in Rome. So it is very likely that they were Christians already. And incidentally, I'll give you another interesting footnote. It may have been Aquila and Priscilla who first excited Paul's heart to go to Rome. So there they're introduced in verse 2, and they are so beloved by Paul that he writes about them again and again.
John MacArthur has just pointed out one of the most uplifting stories in the ministry of Paul is his meeting two devoted friends by the names of Aquila and Priscilla. It is a wonderful story how God has placed these two good friends and co-workers as tent makers in this busy commercial city of Corinth. As we read in these verses, Acts 18:2 and 3, of all places, where were Aquila and Priscilla from? Not only were they from Rome, but as Scripture tells us in Acts, they had been expelled from Rome. Now think about that with me for just a minute. How significant is this connection of Paul and his new friends, Aquila and Priscilla? Yes, Corinth represented a major port. Maybe the news of the Jews being kicked out of Rome would have been expected to be big news also in Corinth. But how neat is this fact? Not only does Paul hear about this devastating event for this church, but he has two eyewitnesses of this monumental event in his presence for an extended period of time. As you remember, they were also leather workers and tent makers. They became the best of friends with Paul. Now let me ask you to ponder this question. Could this great connection and these first-hand eyewitness accounts have any possible impact upon Paul's intent, Paul's purpose, or the reason why Paul wrote what he did in his letter to the church in Rome? It is highly likely. But it gets better. Guess where Aquila and Priscilla were when Paul wrote the letter to the church in Rome? Yes, indeed, they were back in Rome. We know this is fact because Paul asked that they be greeted in chapter 16. Wow! What a wonderful story, and yes, what a crucial piece of evidence of historical background. Paul knew that the very existence of that church was at high risk. Paul knew firsthand that the church in Rome had a grave and a very serious problem. Of course, we know that the Apostle Paul always addresses the problems he is aware of in his letters to the churches. Obviously, he did this routinely as demonstrated in the writing of Galatians, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Ephesians, etc. It was central to whom the Apostle Paul was. That was his ministry. That was his historical pattern. It was also his pattern to go to the Jews first. Throughout his missionary journeys, the apostle to the Gentiles almost always preached to the Jews first. Do you not see? It would be very natural and very much normal that Paul would maintain this same pattern in writing about a major problem to the church of Rome. Paul had major reasons to address their big problem, and since Paul normally addressed the Jews first, would it be surprising that he chose to write to the Jews first? Would it not have been expected that he would seek to reconcile the big rift or feud between the Jewish and the Gentile believers in the church at Rome? Just as we were reminded by Dr. Gordon Fee earlier, historical context provides tremendous insights to the intent of the author. This historical context provides us a great reason for Paul to write to the church in Rome in a two-part fashion. Paul, as a Jew of Jews and as a proven apostle to the Gentiles, knew the distinctions and the differences between Jew and Gentile believers, perhaps like very few did at that time. Paul knew that the two groups were entirely different in their spiritual heritage and church practices, but were to be one in Christ. And since each group had vastly different heritages, would it not make sense as a practice of a good counselor to speak to each opposing party separately? Of course, as a trained counselor, I believe this would be the expected approach. Would Paul not have tried to reassure the Jewish believers that God had not forgot about them, that they still had standing with God, and that God would keep his promises to them? Again, they are in the minority. The Gentiles have taken over the church in Rome. Now, secondly, would it not be understandable that Paul wanted to explain to the Gentile believers how they fit into God's overall plan, which included Israel, and how God had not been unfair to deem that only a remnant of Israel were found faithful, that not all Israel was actually Israel, as we will study later. Paul goes to great extents to instruct the Gentiles regarding living among these Jewish believers. Yes, historical context makes our work in proper exegesis so much more accurate. The church in Rome had a major split, and now the Jewish believers were returning. Those troublemakers were coming back into the church. Do you think that the Gentiles arranged a nice banquet to welcome home all those returning troublemakers? All the evidence indicates absolutely not. Paul knew from first-hand accounts all about the great rift between the Jewish and the Gentile believers. The church in Rome was at high risk. It was a time of high tension. The church in Rome had a major problem and in great need of reconciliation. Now let us proceed to our third major historical consideration, the great gap of 340 years. I think it is important that we at least acknowledge one more historical fact. And this one, unlike the others, is not about the church in Rome, but about how the book of Romans has been interpreted differently beginning at the 340-year mark after Paul wrote Romans. So historically, this is very, very significant because John Calvin and Martin Luther built their interpretation of Romans on that of a bishop who lived from 354 AD to the year 430 AD. His name was Augustine, and he served from about 396 to 430 as the Bishop of Hippo in northern Africa. This is a huge historical fact. Augustine of Hippo is credited as the originator of the doctrine of original sin, about 340 years after the writings of Paul. Consider the fact that the New Testament church was growing at an amazing rate during these 340-year gap. In 1964, Kenneth S. Latourette describes this phenomenal growth during those first 400 years like this. Quote, Christianity won the professed allegiance of the overwhelming majority of the population of the Roman Empire, and even the support of the Roman state, end quote. Robert Louis W. wrote this, by the year 300, Christians made up 10% of the population. Do you suppose that the gospel was not central to this amazing growth? The gospel had to be foremost, and guess what? Most historians and the scholars who have dedicated their study of the church fathers say that during the first 340 years, the common thinking was that anyone could be saved. Any person could be saved. Augustine was the one who formulated a new doctrine, what became known as the doctrine of original sin. I hope to do another study on the history of the early church leading up to the time of Augustine, but the point now is history tells us that Augustine formulated the doctrine of original sin, which in effect redefined who the elect were in Romans. It was his conclusions taken from the book of Romans which played a huge role in his finding. This doctrine was original with him. Think about the gravity of this. What this means is that many, if not all of the people closest to the Apostle Paul and those who were teaching and preaching the truths of Romans during the first 340 years obviously did not teach or preach Augustine's view of original sin.
Loraine Bottner said, a man is not saved because he believes in Christ. He believes in Christ because he is saved. In his book, The Reformed Doctrine of Predestination, on page 365, Loraine Bottner says, speaking of the early church fathers prior to the 4th century, predestination was not made a matter of special study. They assumed that man had full power to accept or reject the gospel.
You and I know that throughout the Old Testament, there is no question that God's chosen people of Israel are defined as the elect. And our study is going to reflect two-part Romans proves that Paul defines the elect in the book of Romans as the remnant of Israel. This is astounding. And by the way, this is why I declared that Paul's writing to the Jews first in the first 8 chapters of Romans represents a lost perspective. I have come to realize that Augustine's view was not the original perspective. A scholarly article in the Harvard Review written by Ernesto Bonatti of Rome, Italy expresses it this way.
Those who are familiar with the books of Augustine have noticed the great change that is thought under went between the years 396 and 397. To this moment, Augustine, still under the strong influence of Neoplatonic philosophy and of Ambrose's thought, conceives of the nature of Adam and Eve before the sin as of an impalpable and ethereal nature, and of our body as a consequence of the sin. In other words, he thinks that sin brought an organic modification in the human being.
Bonatti adds that this explanation to Augustine's new doctrine, mankind is thus an agglomeration of condemned creatures which cannot acquire any merit before God, and whose hopes for forgiveness and atonement are only in the benevolent grace of the Father and the infallible decree of his predestination. End quote. Watch with me how Dr. Keegan Chandler explains Augustine.
I'm going to give you a simple definition of the doctrine for now, and out of necessity a more detailed one later. The Augustinian doctrine of original sin is essentially this: that each member of the human race has inherited sin from Adam, in the sense that we have inherited both Adam's guilt for his sin and a corrupted will which compels us to sin during our lives. In other words, because of Adam's transgression in the garden, a metaphysical stain, God must reach down and supernaturally change us metaphysically so that we are able to obey, so that we are able to choose God.
Also, we have the distinguished Paula Fredrickson, who is a renowned Augustine scholar, educated at Oxford and Princeton University. who has studied Augustine and his works for decades. She has written several books, including When Christians Were Jews and Augustine and the Jews, also Ancient Christianites, the First 500 Years, and many, many more. And this is what she said back at a lecture in 2015.
Here is where Augustine looks precisely at that line in Romans, where Paul says, all Israel will be saved, and Augustine has to redefine what the term Israel means, because he says all Jews will not be saved. The Israel that is saved, he says, is the Israel who believes in God. So it's those who believe in Christ from among the Jews and those who believe in Christ from among the Christians who will be saved, but all Jews by themselves will not be saved. And what I've copied out for you here is the passage where he tries to explain why this is the case. He's set this treatise up as a dialogue. This is again from the Counterfaustum in 399. Why is Israel still blind? Why do Jews still not understand that Augustine is right and Paul was right? And if it's because God himself has hardened their hearts, which is what Paul says, then how can Jews possibly be held morally culpable for not being Christians if God himself prevents them from becoming Christians? And he has this questioner ask, in what ways have the Jews sinned if God was the one who blinded them so that they did not know Christ? And this is his answer. The penalty of this blindness that afflicts the Jews is just, since it is a punishment for secret sins known only to God. He does not say that Jews are guilty of having killed Christ. They did kill Christ, but there is no guilt involved in that, which is again a radical departure from traditional Christian theology. Since they did not know that Jesus was the Messiah, the Jews are not culpable of killing the Messiah. So what are they culpable of? And Augustine says, God only knows. But he means by that, only God knows. But they must be guilty of something, or else they would be saved. And since they're not saved, because they're still Jews, they must be guilty of something, but Augustine doesn't know what. And we would demonstrate that both the apostle, by which he means Paul, and the prophets have spoken about precisely this sort of situation, the judgment of secret sins. For this reason, Paul says, God gave them up to the lusts of their own heart, to an immoral mind, so that they would act in ways that were not fitting. Augustine's a lot like the rabbis, where he will just take a sentence completely out of context and use it for something else if he's trying to get to a point. In saying this, Paul wishes to teach that public, obvious sins occur as the penalty for prior hidden sins, but lest the Jews use their not recognizing Christ as an excuse, the prophet immediately goes on to show that the Jews not recognizing Christ was itself the just penalty for something that they had secretly earned. In other words, says Augustine, Israel's hardening is punitive. It's not strategic, which is what Paul had said. And Israel's hardening is abiding. It's not provisional and temporary, as Paul had said. This has moved some reviewers of my book to remark grumpily that Augustine really isn't that good for the Jews, after all. I mean, what fun is it if a church father says that the Jews aren't saved? And that's why I include the last bit here on your handout. Augustine says, not only are the Jews not saved, he says most of the Christians aren't saved either. Almost nobody is saved according to Augustine's stringent theology. Most of humanity is damned, and he goes back to the image in Paul of God. It's very familiar from the Yom Kippur Machzor of God as a potter, and humanity is clay, and God shapes the pot as he will. And the word for the blob of clay on the potter's wheel is masa. And as you see here, Augustine glosses that to be the massa damnata. Most of humanity after Adam is in this, literally a lump of sin, a lump of all of humanity is fallen. And it's from that lump of fallen humanity that God, for reasons known only to himself, will pinch off a saved person here and a saved person there. But for the most part, not only are Jews, but also Gentiles, including Christian Gentiles, including Catholic Gentiles, are also not among the saved. Heaven is not going to be, or Augustine's heaven is not going to be very crowded. If you look at our last quotation, it's from the City of God. So this is an idea he's repeating toward the end. He dies in 430. This is written around 428. Again, looking back to Romans 9, the whole of mankind is a condemned lump. For he who committed the first sin, Adam, was punished, and along with him all the stock which has its roots in him. The result is that there is no escape for anyone from this justly deserved punishment, except by merciful and undeserved grace. God saves completely as a gift. Many more are condemned by vengeance than are released by mercy. And lest any of you think that Augustine just sounds like another grouchy 4th century church father, I will remind you of the scene of his death, which his biographer recorded, where the last 4 days of his life, Augustine had a fever, requested to be left alone, had 4 penitential psalms copied out, poster-sized, hung on the wall so he could read them from his bed, and would allow somebody to come in simply to give him water. But he spent the last 4 days of his life thinking about his own sins. He was repenting because he was going to the God that he had constructed. Augustine, just because he was a bishop, just because he had spent his entire adult life working for the well-being of the church, and just because he had published the equivalent, this as a professor, I really am astonished by this, just because he had published the equivalent of a 300-page book once a year, every year, for the last 40 years of his life, without a computer, he didn't presume that he himself was saved either. So, does this mean that Augustine was good for the Jews? In his own lifetime, Jews were not in danger of being persecuted. But because of this teaching, which came together because of the reasons particular to the 4th century, Augustine left behind a teaching that in the crueler, later, bloodier days of the Middle Ages would actually be invoked by Christian churchmen to prevent the slaughter of Jews in medieval Europe.
I think you will find this is a fair description of Augustine's new way of thinking. Augustine, unlike what he believed for years, changed his thinking. Augustine formulates this new doctrine of original sin. In his newfound position, he formulates what men no longer have the capacity to respond to God. After Adam's fall, all mankind represents the massa damnata, weighed as historical evidence. The people closest to the Apostle Paul and those who were teaching and preaching the gospel of Romans for 300 plus years obviously did not teach or preach Augustine's view of original sin, which actually redefines the elect. Don't you think this is an amazing discovery to uncover regarding church history? The book of Romans is saturated with Old Testament references, over 50. Our study is going to reflect that the elect of the Old Testament are indeed the elect of the New Testament. In Romans, Paul described a consistent God who will keep his promises with Israel. There is a second very important observation about this gap and Augustine's writings, which, as most of you know, was echoed and adopted by Martin Luther and later John Calvin.
John Calvin wrote, Augustine is so wholly within me that if I wished to write a confession of my faith, I could do so with all fullness and satisfaction to myself out of his writings.
Historical documents of their own writings reflect Augustine and Luther, at least at one time in their lives, expressed great bias against the Jews in their own writings. Augustine's writing was entitled Treatise Against the Jews. Luther's writing was entitled On the Jews and Their Lies. Here's what I said at the debate.
Fascinating that Martin Luther wrote a book called On the Jews and Their Lies. When he was criticized for this, for it being hateful rhetoric and anti-Semitic. Not only Luther, but his hero Augustine wrote a book called Against the Jews. And could their disposition against the Jews and the influence, the great influence that both of these men had, change the course of Christian teaching and the way that people interpret the Bible? I think very much yes, so. I see the potential for someone to discredit the Jewish nature that we see, that I've tried to bring out in the New Testament, and in reinterpreting John and Romans from a very individualistic perspective.
And watch how Dr. White responds to what I said.
You mentioned, and I don't know why, well, I guess okay. You mentioned Luther's anti-Jewish book that he wrote toward the end of his life, right?
Correct.
Were you attempting to say that that book somehow influenced some Reformed dismissal of a focus upon Jews in Romans or somewhere else? Why did you bring that up?
I think it could play a role. I mean, the way that we understand the Bible and the way that we understand culture and things influences the way that we can read. I mean, I don't know all the ins and outs of what was going on with Martin Luther or Augustine, and so, you know, but you can draw, like, why did he write the book? That obviously was something that was heavy and pressing on in his perception of the Jews. And did that influence?
Do you know that Luther held two very different positions on the Jews during his life?
No.
You're not familiar with the pre-1525 Luther or the after 1525 Luther?
For now, let us accept Dr. White's explanation that Luther later in life had a change of heart. Nevertheless, Luther obviously influences many with his writing. Here is a reading of a few sentences that begins Luther's writings on the Jews and their lies.
Therefore be on your guard against the Jews, knowing that wherever they have their synagogues, nothing is found but a den of devils in which sheer self-glory, conceit, lies, blasphemy, and defaming of God and men are practiced most maliciously, envying his eyes on them.
Dr. White's rebuttal defends Luther as having a change of mind. But Dr. White does not defend the writing of Augustine. And by the way, I acknowledge that at times Augustine had favorable things to say about the Jews as God's instrument. This brings us to another major question. Could the bias of Augustine and Luther have swayed their objectivity? Could they possibly had motive to write off or to write out the Jews as the elect? Allow me to ask you, can bias normally sway a person's viewpoint on an issue in question? We don't know the answers to the first two questions for sure, but the point is these questions are pertinent in the process of our search for the truth. As you know, historians tell us that the writings of Augustine, Luther, and Calvin are very much connected. Please subscribe. There is so much more in the upcoming sessions to uncover. I have wonderful news for you, though. When you interpret Romans as having two parts, there are no contradictions. The elect and chosen of the Old Testament are the elect and the chosen of the New Testament. We do not have to explain or defend a general will of God in certain verses and a secret will of God in other verses. And personally, I am very sensitive to all of these claims and positions of Augustine because I was a Calvinist for over 11 years and at times defended these positions of Augustine, Luther, and Calvin by using some of these terms. So I find it hard for anyone to deny that a huge change came about because of Augustine's new doctrine of original sin and election, from which all practical purposes redefined the gospel. Again, this happened about 340 years after the writing of Paul. Even Reformed historians agree that this was the very first point in history. So think about that length of time with me. 340 years is a long time. The United States of America is about 250 years old. Can you imagine a rewrite of history concerning George Washington, saying that he was really an agent being compensated by France? Or consider a possible rewrite of history saying that George Washington did not revere God at all, and he intentionally faked his public faith in God? I think you would respond like me, that after these years, a revision of such major proportions is absurd. But you see, the historical facts is that Augustine was the very first to argue for this position concerning the very gospel of Jesus Christ. For 300 plus years, history tells us that many, if not a vast majority of believers and people considered that anyone could be saved. Think about it. The common belief among many, including those closest to Paul and his friends, was that anyone could be saved, and that any person had the capacity to respond to God in faith. But with Augustine, 340 years later, all that changed. This 340-year gap is an historical fact. You will ask why this history about the understanding of Romans is so important. I agree that James White is somewhat correct if you consider biblical history to begin with Augustine.
As a quick summary, it is important to note the great expulsion of the Jews in AD 49, along with the great connection that Paul had with Aquila and Priscilla in Corinth, learning about that expulsion, and then the return of the Jews back into the Roman church. Adding to the fact that Augustine changed the way that we interpret Romans, all of this makes for massive consideration as we read the book of Romans.
And to be clear, I stand by the position I took at the debate. I contend that Romans was written in two parts. First to the Jews in the first 8 chapters, and then to the Gentiles in the second 8 chapters. Based on what I've explained in this session, this understanding, I believe, was the original understanding. Allow me to express it like this. The Apostle Paul did in fact write to the Jews and Gentiles separately within the letter that Phoebe delivered to the church in Rome. That is why I have described two-part Romans as the lost perspective. The book of Romans has been misunderstood. Now, in preparation for session 3, please consider reading through the entire book of Romans. And I would say in one sitting if you can. That's the recommended approach by Dr. Gordon Fee, and it would be great if you could do this on a 7 consecutive day stretch. Many of you have already read in Dr. Lay's book. It is his testimony that he first realized that Paul wrote Romans in 2 parts upon the 28th consecutive reading of the book of Romans within 1 week. As you read, please mark any place where it appears Paul speaks in first person to the Jews, as well as any place where it appears Paul speaks in first person to the Gentiles. And be prepared to be amazed. I want to encourage you to ask your church friends and others to join us on this exciting journey of monumental importance. May the Lord bless you in your studies. Go and be good. Berean.